Vladimir Putin and his spokesman in the Kremlin have made it official that they have no interest in any kind of peace deal with the Trump administration. Is this finally going to be taken for what we all know it is? The evidence that Putin is committed to one thing and one thing only: pursuing more war. And will the administration actually find the spine to stand up to him? Seems like the answer is probably not. Plus, we're going to talk about the president threatening, of course, to bomb Iran, why this tactic is, well, frankly, not really getting him anywhere. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay. So this is really interesting. Russia coming out explicitly and saying it cannot accept Trump's Ukraine peace plans, right? This is coming from the Russian deputy foreign minister, so an actual government figure. And he has come out and said that the U.S. is, quote, not taking into account Russia's main demand to secure peace. Of course, its main demand, they won't actually specify. They'll just simply say the root causes. And this is, if you know anything about stalling tactics, you know that this is a classic one, right? Nothing is more politician than sitting there and saying, I have a plan to address the problem. Step 1 is analyze the problem. Step 2 is find the root causes. Step 3 is address those root causes. And you go, wow, that's not a plan. That's just you describing the issue. And this is, of course, what Russia's doing, because ultimately it refuses to come out and say the truth explicitly, which is that the root cause is that Russia feels it should own Ukraine. The irony, of course, being that within the Russian media space, Vladimir Putin is very explicit that he feels he has to annex Ukraine because Ukraine isn't supposed to be a free country. It's supposed to be Russians, right? Russians are just a cut above. They're the superior people in Central Asia, or Eurasia, as he calls it. And this sort of scheme is something that everyone, seemingly in the international community, is unwilling to say. Because if they were to come out and say it, the actual truth, which is that Russia has adopted an ideology of hyper-aggressive nationalism, it would mean that the current tactic of Europe of funding the Ukrainians, but not actually really showing up for them, and the current tactic of the administration, which is to stick it to Ukraine for some reason, are all naive, and that the only way to end the Russian aggression is to militarily defeat Vladimir Putin. But no one in any kind of position of power wants to swallow that pill, and so the Russians continue what they've been up to, right? According to this interview, the deputy foreign minister, Ryabkov, has said, quote, "We haven't heard from Trump a signal to Kiev to end the war." Definitely not true. He continues, quote, "All we have today is an attempt to find a scheme that would allow us to achieve a ceasefire as conceived by the Americans." And then he says they'd move on to some other model and scheme, which, as far as we can judge today, there is no place for our main demand, namely the solution of problems related to the root causes of the conflict, which is preposterous, right? But obviously, right, they are out there saying we can't accept any American proposal as is. We have our own priorities and approaches to this topic, which are being worked out. And I think the key takeaway here is that, again, Russia is showing exactly who they are. They're interested in pursuing further conflict. And you have to think, if you are Vladimir Putin, he was willing to continue the war when the U.S. was fully supporting Ukraine. He was willing to continue the war when his forces were pushed out of Kharkiv and Kherson. Right? He was willing to continue the war when Europe and the United States were shoulder to shoulder in their support, and the sanctions had no chance of being lifted. And so the fact is that why would he ever abandon his war aims now if things have never looked better for him, right? The U.S. has never been less committed to supporting Ukraine. The Europeans have never looked weaker and more fractured. So why on earth would he stop at his moment of victory? That's just, I don't like the guy, and I think you'd be crazy to stop prosecuting your war when your enemy is at their weakest. Of course, President Trump, out here with some 5D chess or whatever, who's definitely putting the pressure on Putin by pressuring Zelensky, saying, quote, he's trying to back out of a rare earth deal, and if he does that, he's got some problems, big problems, Trump told journalists. Notably, Putin, he does not use this language with Putin. In fact, he refuses to even say that Putin is capable of doing wrong. He's saying, I'm not blaming Putin. I'm not blaming him. Well, the rest of us are. And of course, Trump then followed that up by throwing away his biggest negotiating chip in any kind of peace deal, explicitly saying that Ukraine is never going to be a NATO member. This is, of course, a bargaining chip that Trump has simply taken and thrown into the trash instead of using it to extract any kind of concession from the Russians. And so this whole thing, right? The rumors are, of course, that this mineral deal involves Ukraine paying back the United States for aid. Now, when the aid was provided, of course, there was no discussion of payment, but nothing says South Florida real estate scammer like sending someone a bill when they never agreed on a price in the first place. So this probably feels like old hat for someone like Trump. Meanwhile, of course, Vladimir Putin, this is actually an example of actually, I think, bad reporting. Now, it says Vladimir Putin signs a decree calling up 160,000 Russians for military service. Technically true, but this is part of a standard conscription cycle by the Russian military. Now, to be clear, a portion of that 160,000 will almost certainly sign military contracts after the completion of their mandatory conscription period. And the appeal, of course, is that by going through their standard conscription, they're going to get a basic level of military training so that if they do sign a contract, they'll be able to transition immediately into the Russian armed forces. But this is, again, a routine conscription that is actually, though, noteworthy because it is about 10 to 15% higher than we saw last year. And this is a function of the fact that Putin is raising the maximum age for conscription up to 30 years old. And all of this, again, is indicating that if there was a stronger, more cohesive stance around opposing Vladimir Putin, one, you don't raise your conscription age and raise your sign-on bonuses because your manpower generation cycle is going great. But more importantly, it shows that there are cracks in the armor. For some reason, the administration is treating Putin as though his state is capable of sustaining this war machine indefinitely, forever and ever. There are grave problems with the Russian military, grave problems with Russia's force generation and their ability to sustain this fight. And again, a United States that was pushing hard and willing to really test Putin and Russia economically, demographically, geopolitically, and militarily would really have a good chance to achieve a lasting victory in Ukraine, right? Of course, none of that's going to happen. Right. But before we talk about, of course, Trump's going back to the well on his favorite negotiating tactic, I wanted to mention, of course, that if you haven't picked up your Strike gum, well, you should. Why aren't you? Right? It's got all the caffeine of an energy drink, 90 milligrams. That's as much as a Red Bull, as much as an Amp Energy, but zero sugar. And of course, there's 5 of them in a pack. So you can throw that pack in your gym bag, in your car. I even fit it in my pocket when I'm doing long bike rides or long runs. And when I need to pick me up, I just pop a piece, chew it, and boom, the caffeine hits you like that. There's a reason that 50% of everyone who has chewed a single piece of Strike gum has reordered. It's because it is superior to an energy drink in every way. So check it out. The link is in the description. Okay, so I want to point this out because, again, one of the things that just blows my mind is the number of people who really think that Trump personally is a good negotiator. I think some of his staff may be okay negotiators, not Steve Witkoff, but Mike Walls, Keith Kellogg, Marco Rubio. These are savvy people. But here's what I find most absurd. Trump is going back to the well, threatening to bomb Iran if it doesn't make a nuclear deal. Now, you might recall that Trump threatened to bomb Hamas literally like a month ago if they didn't return all the hostages. And not only did Hamas not return the hostages, but the Gaza ceasefire deal brokered by Steve Witkoff fell apart. So clearly threatening, and worth pointing out, there are no U.S. warplanes airplanes bombing Hamas. So when Trump was like, I'm going to bomb you if you don't do this or else, clearly that was not serious. That should not have been taken seriously. And Hamas has faced no meaningful consequences. All they've done is said, wow, we're back to where we started, but we did get a little bit of a break to rest and recharge. And so obviously, if there's one thing we know about the president, he seems unable to learn from his failures. So the failure of that deal, of course, he said, well, maybe I just didn't tweet hard enough. And if I just tweeted a harder threat to Iran, saying that there would be bombings and secondary tariffs if Tehran did not come to an agreement with Washington over its nuclear program. Worth noting that there was an agreement with Iran over its nuclear program about a decade ago. During his first term, Trump withdrew from that deal. And of course, Iran has rejected direct negotiations with Washington. In fact, he uses even the exact same phrase he uses with Hamas, which is it will be bombing the likes of which they've never seen before. And he said there's a chance if they don't make a deal, I'll do secondary tariffs on them like I did 4 years ago. Now, what I think is sort of interesting is that they've come out and said, right, that Iran, well, if you're going to play this game of threatening us, the more you threaten us, the more likely we are to develop nuclear weapons. Why? Because nuclear weapons are a cheap, relatively speaking, relative to, for example, standing up a giant military. They're cheap in an easy way to deter these kind of strikes, right? You notice how differently Trump treats Vladimir Putin, who has nuclear weapons, relative to entities that don't. And once other countries figure this out, right, you notice too, North Korea, this is a country that Trump has not threatened to bomb. He has not threatened to do anything with. In fact, he's been very friendly and amenable to North Korea. And so this sort of willingness to threaten people who don't have nukes is incentivizing every single, really Tom, Dick, and Harry country to develop their own nuclear program. And this is, I think, just a classic sign. Because remember, Iran, it feels like they got whiplash. Like 10 years ago, we reached an agreement with the U.S. to not develop nukes. And now you withdrew from it. The U.S. withdrew from it. And now they're saying we have to do another deal or else you'll bomb us. And Iran's saying, listen, every time this happens, every time we get threatened with military force, if we don't do what you want, like what's going to stop you from using this negotiating tactic again, right? It's a shakedown. And don't get me wrong, I'm not here being like Iran is great, right? But the question is, how do you deal with a hostile actor given the tools that we're willing to use? Again, if Trump says Iran can't have nuclear weapons, we're going to take military action to end Iran's nuclear capacity, and they're, okay, that's a geopolitical choice. But again, it's clear that he's threatened. These are empty threats. But Iran is sitting there going, listen, we cannot be bullied militarily like this, so we have to take some kind of action. So you can see how it's essentially this thing. Once you live in a world where might makes right, where if you can bomb them and they can't bomb you, you get to threaten and demand anything you want, then you create an incentive structure in which the only thing that matters to countries is to have the maximum amount of firepower. And the easiest, fastest, cheapest way to get the maximum firepower in the modern world is nuclear weapons. So you can see how badly this is starting to backfire as more and more countries are going to figure out that Trump will will let you do essentially whatever you want when you have nukes, and will threaten and coerce and cajole you when you don't. You may notice that the other countries he's threatening to annex are countries like Denmark, an ally, but they don't have nuclear weapons. He also threatens Canada, an ally, but doesn't have nuclear weapons. So you can see how there's really increasingly this movement, this perception that there's only two countries in the world. There are victims and there are nuclear powers. And the problem is, of course, if you have 210 nuclear powers, it creates a very dangerous situation because statistically, a couple of those are going to be reckless, crazy dictators who, will look at these tools and say, why should I not use this tool? Now, I want to point out one other story that I think is pretty important. That's really worth discussing. And that is that the administration, we've talked a lot We haven't talked that much, actually, about the Trump administration deportations. Now, don't get me wrong. If a judge says you have to be deported, you should be deported. No gripes here. And if you're a member of a dangerous gang and you can prove that to a judge, you know, if you don't have an asylum case, yeah, go home. But the administration has started to play fast and loose with some of the rules, right? We've talked about the fact that one Salvadorian was actually, well, the U.S. government has admitted we weren't supposed to deport him, but we did it anyway. A judge actually told ICE, this is a sworn affidavit by an ICE AFOD, an assistant field office director in Harlingen, and he has sworn in a sworn statement submitted to the court that he actually removed or ordered the administration ordered the removal of this individual who was determined. You know, they said, oh, he's a gang member, blah 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 blah, but the immigration court said, listen, he has one more appeal. He has a right to use it before you deport him. You gotta keep him in the U.S. so he can exhaust his final appeal before he's deported. And ICE said, literally, this was done in error. But here's what's crazy, right? Here's what was crazy, right? You know, every government system makes mistakes, but the two parts that are insane is one, right? Let's see if we can find it here. Right. They say through an administrative error, this individual was removed from the United States to El Salvador. It was an oversight. They say it was good faith based on a final removal order. But let's see, the grant of removal. Here we go. ICE was aware that a judge said we're going to withhold his removal at the time, and it was on internal ICE forms. So ICE says we knew a judge told us, hey, this guy's got a right to an appeal. Don't kick him out. And then I said, go fuck off. This is the problem. The reason this is a problem is not because I love gang members. It's because everybody gets due process. That's the point. Everybody gets their day in court, right? What if he said, listen, I get my day in court because I can prove I'm not an MS-13 member. I can prove it to you. Or even worse, what if he said, I can prove I'm actually a U.S. citizen, right? I can prove I have a visa. Well, the only place you can legally do that, you can't simply, right? You can't hand an ICE, you can't do it in jail. You can't do it on a flight. You have to do it in a court of law. That's where you prove things. And so if you don't give everyone, the opportunity to prove their case, then what you do is you have a Russian style of justice system in which when the state deems you a problem, their system of justice exists solely to create the theater, the perception that something good, that there's some kind of fair process, but there isn't. The state deems you an enemy, and then the state disappears you, right? You get Alexei Navalny, right? And people will say, right, pro-Putin shills will say, well, guys, Alexei Navalny was convicted of terrorism in a court. Sure. But the court was never fair. He never had a real shot. The state deemed him a terrorist. And then the courts existed simply to exercise the state's will, to basically write some documents that say, yep, he's a terrorist. And you have to worry that the administration, again, is sitting there saying, hey, a judge told us to do this, told us to bring this person back. And they said, nah, we're not going to. Again, maybe this is just maybe this will be all we see of this, but my fear is that this is going to become a trend where they're going to push the boundaries more and more, and they're going to take someone who says, I can prove I'm a U.S. citizen. You can't send me to an El Salvadorian prison for no reason. And they're going to say, nah, I'm not going to listen to this. Get out of here. And that is that would be a disturbing direction if that's where things go. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, guys, Martin, Gina Cresta, Chris Cortes, Francis Karras, L90, Petra Toru, and Jalen Gao. Thanks to all of our lieutenant tier members. I can't do this without you guys. I appreciate y'all so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.